today's gospel lesson, we have a group of people trying to trap Jesus in a battle of words. This happens often in the gospel. In fact, the passage immediately preceding this one, the Pharisees tried to trap Jesus by asking him whether it is lawful for a good Jew to pay taxes to Rome or not. That was a trick question because the money that you had to pay the taxes with had the emperor's image engraved on it and said right on the coin itself that the Roman emperor was a god. And a good Jew was not supposed to carry around anything with a graven image on it that said that there was another god besides the God of Israel. So they tried to trick Jesus that way. Well, in this week's lesson, we have the other party of the Hebrew people trying to trap Jesus. You know, it's like, I suppose it's kind of like the Republicans and the Democrats today. Last week was the Pharisees, this week is the Sadducees. We have the Sadducees posing an equally difficult question. A little background might be helpful for us who don't practice Levitical marriage. Back in the time of Moses, about 1300 BC, the Jewish people had no concept of an afterlife. Instead of heaven or hell, the early Jewish people thought that when you died, everybody, whether you were good or bad, went down to Sheol. You'll see references to Sheol in the Psalms from time to time. Sheol was sort of a place of gray nothingness. It was neither hot nor cold. It wasn't totally dark nor light with the bright of day. You wouldn't feel any hunger or thirst, but neither would you ever feel satisfied. You wouldn't be happy and you wouldn't be sad. I suppose that a concept of limbo would be the nearest thing that we would have to Sheol. But once you went down to Sheol at your death, there was no leaving. There's where you were going to be forever. It wasn't a terrible place, but it wasn't a great place either. It was just sort of gray nothingness. And since you could never leave Sheol, the early Jewish people thought that the only way you lived on after you were dead was if you had children, and your children lived on your behalf. So if you had children, you lived on, and if you died without children, you were cut off. You simply did not live on. So in their thinking, it was really important for everybody to have children. They also thought at the time that the father contributed the entire human being in the process of reproduction. Reproduction was thought to be like farming. The seed was planted by the father, and the only function that the mother served was to provide a fertile field where the seed was to grow in. And so if a husband died without producing children, his brother was supposed to do the planting for him on his behalf, since the brother, they thought, carried the exact same seed as his deceased brother did. So based on this misunderstanding of human reproduction, back in Genesis chapter 38, Judah tells Onan to go to his dead brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law and raise up children for his dead brother. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 25, God commands that if two brothers live together in an extended household, and one of them dies without having a surviving son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married to anybody outside of the family. Her deceased husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, not to the living one, so that his name may not be lost to the tribe of Israel. To our minds, this is sort of creepy, isn't it? Can you imagine brother-in-law having this duty to your sister-in-law today? You know, this is just weird and creepy stuff. But in their time, it wasn't intended to be creepy. Rather, it was to be sweet, to the dead brother and keep his name alive. That was their thinking at the time. In terms of reproductive science, it was clearly mistaken, and certainly not something that our modern concepts of morality would encourage. But if you thought that human reproduction was like planting seed in a field, and that the males in the family all carried the same variety of seed, sort of like, you know, by the side of the cornfield, you see we plant so-and-so seed here, kind of like that. It kind of makes sense, you know, in its own little twisted way. The law of Moses had two practical purposes. First, a woman whose husband died, had no means of support in those days, and the command that the family would take care of her kept her from being an outcast and starving. Secondly, since at that time they didn't believe in an afterlife other than living on through your children, it had the effect of letting someone live on after their death, even though they had no children of their own. You can see that the ideas about human reproduction in 1300 BC were rather primitive compared to what we know. I have a friend whose daughter is a reproductive endocrinologist, something that would have not existed back at that time at all. And so, in the law of Moses, their concepts of morality were based on the limited scientific knowledge of 1300 BC. As an aside, the next time someone quotes Leviticus as being authoritative on questions of morality in the modern human world, remind them of this passage for me and remind them of how crazy it was. You know, this passage about going to have sex with your dead brother's ex-wife, you know. It's, I've tread enough in dangerous waters, so now back to the story. By Jesus' time, reproductive sciences were still pretty much in the same place they were at Moses' time, but there were several religious divisions among the Jewish people. The Pharisees and the Essenes believed in an afterlife. The Jewish Roman historian Josephus, try saying that 3 times. The Jewish Roman historian Josephus said that the Pharisees, quote, hold that every soul is imperishable, but only the souls of the good pass into another body, whereas the souls of the wicked are punished with eternal penalties, unquote. Josephus also said that the Pharisees believed that the souls of the good remain spotless and obedient. They obtain a very holy place in heaven, from which at the turn of the age they will again inhabit bodies. So Josephus says that the Pharisees believed sort of in a reincarnation of sorts that you get. He reports that the Essenes also believed that the souls were immortal, but without the reincarnation business. And so you can think of both the Pharisees and the Essenes as sort of the New Age version of Judaism. They had gone on to new beliefs. Both groups had adopted the idea of the immortality of the soul, which is actually a Greek idea from Plato, not a Jewish idea from the Old Testament, if you catch on with that. The Sadducees, on the other hand, they were the traditionalist ruling class, and they continued their belief of Moses' time that there was no afterlife other than Sheol, and that souls were not naturally immortal. So in our lesson today, the Sadducees are trying to get Jesus to stake him out as one of them. They're trying to get him on their side and point out how ridiculous it would be for one brother after another brother after another brother after another brother, all the way through 7 brothers, to marry the same woman, and whose wife would she be in heaven? Well, Jesus is not about to get trapped. He first answers that a marriage is an institution of this age. The Greek word aeon, can mean either age or world. He says, those who belong to this world marry and are given in marriage, But those who are considered worthy of a place in that world and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. In other words, Jesus tells us that our earthly social institutions like marriage will not continue in heaven. When you think about it, marriage exists at least partially for the survival of the human species. And in a resurrected state, if you don't die, why would the species need to reproduce itself? So while we might know and love our spouses in heaven, the institution of marriage will disappear. He points out that way back in Exodus, God identified himself to Moses as the God of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had died some 500 or 600 years before Moses ever lived. And so they must be living in some sense to God, for God is a God of the living, for God who gives us life in the first place. And for him, all of us are living, capable of relationship with God. Jesus speaks about an afterlife in a permanently resurrected state in another realm, not a reincarnation in this world where all you get to do is die over and over and over again. Where's the good in that? And Jesus talks about that resurrected life as taking place now. He says that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are currently alive to God, even 2,000 years ago, not at some future general resurrection of the dead. In our lesson today, Jesus tells us that all those whom we love but see no longer are not going to die again. They don't have to die over and over and over again because they're living. They're like angels and the children of God, for we're all children of the resurrection at that point. And they are children of God who now live with God in heaven. The only thing left behind is the earthly home that they moved out of. And the point is simply that to God, everyone is alive. And finally, notice that in the aion, the life of the world to come, the whole concept of passing ownership from father to new husband to new husband to new husband in the case of Leviratical marriage 7 times, likewise vanishes into the justice of God, where women are neither married nor given in marriage, but rather are their own individual people. You know, they get to be themselves with every right of males. So the thing to know is that heaven is going to be a big surprise to us all. It is. It's going to be a big surprise. And what we expect from our experience in this world is not exactly what's going to happen in heaven. And while we may make it into heaven and the life of the world to come, our earthly institutions and customs may not make it into heaven and the life of the world to come. This all brings me back to share with you a dream that I had when I was a teenager. It was very instructional to me. I shared this dream with my friend and mentor, Bishop Frank Vest, a few days before he died from COPD. And he laughed and he said, "Don't make me laugh, I can't breathe," you know? Bless his heart. Anyhow, when I was a teenager, I dreamed that I died and miraculously enough, I went to heaven. That was a miracle right there. And when I got to heaven and went in, it was just like a giant cathedral. It looked like a big cathedral, except that it didn't have a roof. Didn't need a roof because the blue and perfect sky with the perfect clouds and the perfect sun was coming in where a roof should be. And instead of stained glass, the windows were wide open to the beauties of heaven because there was no stained glass that could be more beautiful than what you could see through the window. You see what I'm saying? And when I entered this cathedral, it was full of people, and some of them I knew, and some of them I didn't know who they were, even though they all seemed to know me and who I was. And they all said to me, "Oh, Ed, come on in. He's waiting for you down at the altar. You know, just come on in and go see him. Go see him. It's just great and wonderful." And as I walked toward the altar down the great stone aisle, and I climbed up a lot of steps. There were so many steps you couldn't see what was at the top of the platform, you know? You couldn't see over the horizon of the platform. And finally, after I climbed up to the steps and got to the top and could see over the steps, there was God. Except, instead of being like the God I always imagined, God was dressed in a pink chiffon Hare Krishna outfit with a shaved head except for a ponytail that came out his back of his head. I looked in horror because God was not at all who I was expecting to see. And I said, "Oh no," but actually I said, "Oh shit." You know, it was and God laughed. God laughed at me when I reacted in shock at who God was. It wasn't a mean laugh. It wasn't a horrible laugh. It was a laugh that sort of said, "Don't worry, nobody ever gets me quite right." You know? So none of us, and that taught me that first of all, God is always a big surprise. And second of all, it taught me not to worry if I don't get God exactly right, because nobody does. We all get him just a little off. In her commentary on this passage, the Reverend Kendra Moan, a Lutheran pastor, says, Jesus is calling us to imagine what it is like to live without the fear of death, so that we can approach our lives differently. If all of this is true, if through Jesus we're all children of the resurrection, how then does that free us? How do we spend our time? How do we spend our money? How do we spend our energy? So this week, I invite all of us to engage in speculating in our minds, imagining what the life of the world to come might be like. You know, a world where there is no aches or pains, a world where there is no grief, a world where there is no sickness or poverty, a world where there is plenty for everybody, a world that is welcoming and open to everyone. And then I invite us after that for us to live as much as possible in this world as though what we pray all the time has come true. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.